darkness falls on the narrow alleys of Whitechapel. The year is 1888. Gas lamps flicker against a cold fog that creeps along the cobbled streets like a living thing. Footsteps echo in silence, swallowed by the shadows of the East End. The people are afraid, terrified of a man no one can name, no one can see, and no one can stop. He was never caught, never seen in the act, and yet he struck with such gruesome precision the world still shudders at the mention of his name, Jack the Ripper. For over a century, his identity has remained hidden behind blood-stained mystery. A phantom who murdered at least 5 women, perhaps more, and then vanished into legend. Was he a madman, a doctor, a prince, or something far more sinister? In this documentary, we'll descend into the underbelly of Victorian London to retrace the killer's steps, unravel the theories, and sift through the chilling clues that have haunted generations. Because the question still echoes through time. Who was Jack the Ripper, and why did he stop? The East End of London in 1888 was a place few dared to tread after dark. It was a world of overcrowded tenements, open sewage, and grinding poverty. The streets were lined with the forgotten and the desperate, immigrants, laborers, beggars, and women forced to sell their bodies for a few coins just to survive the night. The police presence was minimal, and trust in the authorities was even less. In Whitechapel, people lived on the edge and death was never far. But nothing could have prepared them for what came next. In the early hours of August 31st, 1888, a carman named Charles Cross was walking down Bucks Row on his way to work. It was still dark. The silence was typical, but something on the ground caught his eye, a figure lying in the shadows. At first, he thought it was a drunk, passed out on the side of the road. It was the mutilated body of Mary Ann Nichols. Her throat had been slit twice and her abdomen viciously torn open. Blood pooled beneath her, but the killer had left her lying neatly, almost with care. There was no sign of struggle, no witnesses, no sound. Whoever had done this had vanished into the fog like a ghost. Just 1 week later, on September 8th, another woman, Annie Chapman, was found murdered in a backyard on Hanbury Street. Her throat was slashed and her body eviscerated, the killer removing her uterus with a surgeon's precision. Panic spread like wildfire. The newspapers erupted with gruesome headlines. Rumors of a madman stalked the alleys, and the press gave him a name, Jack the Ripper, after a taunting letter arrived at the Central News Agency, signed in blood-red ink with those chilling words. By the end of the fall, 3 more women, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly, would be slaughtered. The last of them, Mary Kelly, was found in her room, her body so horrifically mutilated that even hardened police officers recoiled from the scene. Each murder was more savage than the last, each victim left with fewer answers and more questions. The killings were surgical, calculated, almost ritualistic. And then, just as quickly as he had come, the Ripper vanished. No more murders, no arrests, no justice. Only fear and legend. London in 1888 was a city divided, not just by class, but by fear. The West End, with its opulent theaters and well-dressed elite, seemed like a different world from the East End's grimy streets and rotting buildings. But now, with Jack the Ripper prowling the slums, even the wealthy looked over their shoulders. The media stoked the fire. Newspapers printed every grisly detail. They described the torn bodies, the slashed throats, the precise cuts. Readers devoured every word, and for the first time, mass media turned murder into a spectacle. The public couldn't get enough. The press gave the killer not just attention, but power. As panic grew, so did the criticism. People began to blame the police for failing to stop the carnage. Scotland Yard, ill-equipped for such a predator, found itself fumbling in the dark, literally. There were no fingerprints, no surveillance, no forensics, just bodies, rumors, and a killer who seemed to vanish like mist. Hundreds of letters poured in, some from the public, others purporting to be from the killer himself. Most were hoaxes, but one would become infamous, the Dear Boss letter. It was signed, "Yours truly, Jack the Ripper," and promised more blood to come. It ended with a chilling line, "I will clip the lady's ears off and send to the police just for jolly." A week later, Catherine Eddowes was found dead, with part of her ear missing. Whether the letter was real or not, it didn't matter. The name had taken root. Jack the Ripper had become more than a man. He was a monster. Police patrolled the streets in greater numbers. Vigilante groups formed. Every dark figure in the fog became a suspect, but still no arrest, no face, no name. And amid the chaos, a chilling realization began to settle in. Jack the Ripper wasn't just killing women. He was killing the illusion of safety. He could be anyone, anywhere, and no one knew when or where he would strike again. History often remembers Jack the Ripper, but it forgets his victims. They were not just names in a newspaper or footnotes in a police file. They were daughters. Some were mothers. They had stories, struggles, dreams, and they lived in a world that had already turned its back on them long before the Ripper found them. Mary Ann Nichols, known to her friends as Polly, was 43 years old. She had 5 children, though she had long been estranged from her family. She bounced from workhouse to lodging house, her life marked by poverty and alcoholism. On the night of August 30th, she was turned away from a hostel for not having the few pence required for a bed. She told the keeper, "I'll soon get my DOS money. See what a jolly bonnet I've got now." She walked off into the night and never returned. Annie Chapman was 47. She had once lived a comfortable life, married to a coachman. But after years of decline, illness, and alcoholism, she ended up in Whitechapel. On the morning of her death, September 8th, she was seen arguing with a man described as shabby genteel. Minutes later, her throat was cut, and her body mutilated in a yard just feet from occupied houses. No one heard a sound. Elizabeth Stride, 44, had emigrated from Sweden. She had a troubled marriage, a past of petty crime, and had suffered the loss of a child. On the night of September 30th, she was seen with a man outside a club on Berner Street. Moments later, she was found with her throat slashed, but without the usual mutilations. Some believe the killer was interrupted before he could finish. But he wasn't done. Less than an hour later, Catherine Eddowes, 46, was found in Mitre Square. Her murder was savage. Her face was mutilated, her organs removed with terrifying precision. The killer carved her like a surgeon, then vanished into the darkness once more. Then came the most horrifying of all. Mary Jane Kelly was just 25, the youngest of the canonical victims. Unlike the others, she had a room of her own, a small, cold space at 13 Miller's Court. On November 9th, her landlord sent someone to collect her overdue rent. What they found behind the locked door was beyond description. Mary's body was found on the bed, virtually unrecognizable. Her throat was cut to the spine. Her body flayed open, organs scattered across the room. Flesh was stripped from her face. Even her heart was missing. It was the last known Ripper killing. And with it, the monster disappeared. 5 women, all of them poor, all of them vulnerable, all of them failed by a society that saw them as expendable. Their deaths shook the world, but their lives were largely forgotten. Now, more than a century later, we remember them not as props in a murder mystery, but as real women, as the reason this story still matters. Because Jack the Ripper's true legacy is not the mystery he left behind. It's the lives he stole. From the moment the Ripper vanished, one question consumed the world. Who was he? Theories have filled libraries. Suspects have numbered in the hundreds, but the truth remains elusive. Still, among the swirling rumors and yellowed police files, certain names rise above the rest, each more disturbing than the last. The first is Montague John Drute, a barrister and schoolteacher with a history of mental illness. Just weeks after the final murder, his body was pulled from the River Thames, an apparent suicide. Some officers believed his death marked the end of the killings. One even wrote that the mad doctor had been quietly removed from the streets. But Drute had no known medical training, and no hard evidence ever linked him to the crimes. His inclusion was based on whispers and timing. Then there's Aaron Kosminski, a Polish immigrant and barber who lived in Whitechapel. He suffered from severe mental illness, with paranoid delusions and a deep hatred of women. He was committed to an asylum shortly after the murders ended. In 1894, a senior police official wrote that Kosminski had been identified by a witness, but refused to testify. In recent years, a controversial claim emerged. That DNA from a shawl found at one of the crime scenes matched a descendant of Kosminski. But experts have questioned the chain of custody, the testing methods, and the reliability of the sample. No conviction, no certainty. Another man, Michael Ostrog, was a Russian con artist and known criminal with a long record of violent offenses. He used multiple aliases and had access to surgical tools. But during the Ripper murders, he may have been imprisoned elsewhere. Scotland Yard eventually ruled him out. And then there's Dr. Thomas Neil Cream, a physician known for poisoning his victims. He was hanged for murder in 1892. According to legend, his final words were, "I am Jack the," before the trapdoor dropped. But there's a problem. At the time of the Ripper killings, Cream was in prison in Illinois. Unless he had a double or escaped, he couldn't have been in London. Yet rumors persisted. Other names flooded the press and the public imagination. Prince Albert Victor, grandson of Queen Victoria, accused by conspiracy theorists despite a lack of any credible link. Sir William Gull, the Queen's physician, was cast as a royal cover-up villain in sensational books and films. These stories are thrilling, but largely fictional. And still, the shadows deepen. Perhaps the most chilling suspect of all was no one famous at all. Just a man, ordinary, unnoticed, who walked the alleys of Whitechapel and vanished without a trace. Maybe he wasn't a doctor, or a prince, or a madman. Maybe he was something far worse, invisible. Because sometimes the most dangerous monsters are the ones we never see coming. While blood painted the streets of Whitechapel, ink stained the desks of journalists and police inspectors. Beginning in September 1888, a series of letters began arriving, written in a macabre, almost gleeful tone. They described the murders with disturbing familiarity. Some were crude, others were elegant, most were hoaxes, but a few still chill the spine. The first to make headlines was the infamous Dear Boss letter, received by the Central News Agency on September 27th. Written in bright red ink, meant to mimic blood, it read, "I keep on hearing the police have caught me, but they won't fix me just yet. I am down on whores, and I shan't quit ripping them till I do get buckled. The next job I do, I shall clip the lady's ears off and send to the police just for jolly." It was signed for the first time, Jack the Ripper. 2 days later, Catherine Eddowes was found dead, and part of her ear had been cut. Coincidence or prophecy? Suddenly, the name Jack the Ripper was everywhere. The press ran with it. The public fed on it. And the killer, if he'd truly written it, had just given himself a brand. But the horror didn't stop there. On October 1st came the Saucy Jackie postcard, also postmarked with gruesome references to the double murder of Stride and Eddowes. Double event this time. Number one squealed a bit, couldn't finish straight off. The tone was mocking, triumphant, and eerily in sync with the details of the crimes. But the most grotesque correspondence of all arrived in a small cardboard box. It contained half of a human kidney, preserved in wine. With it came the From Hell letter. The handwriting was different, more crude, the spelling erratic, but the message was clear. "I send you half the kidney I took from one woman, t'other piece I fried and ate it." There was no signature, only the chilling return address, From Hell. Was it real? Catherine Eddowes had indeed had a kidney removed, but medical officials couldn't confirm whether the one in the box matched hers. The letter's crude tone differed from the others, and many believed it was another hoax. Yet something about it felt closer to the truth, more visceral, more monstrous. In total, more than 600 letters were received by police and the press. Most were ruled out. Some were traced to journalists, trying to boost circulation with sensational fear. Others came from pranksters, drunks, even children. But those early letters, the ones that came during the height of the murders, still stir unease. If Jack the Ripper did write them, then he wasn't just a killer. He was playing a game. And London was his board. Scotland Yard was desperate. As the body count rose, so did the pressure on London's Metropolitan Police. Public trust was crumbling. Newspapers mocked their incompetence, and with every new victim, the people demanded answers. But 19th century policing was ill-equipped to catch a ghost. There were no surveillance systems, no forensic databases, no real understanding of criminal profiling. The force relied on foot patrols, eyewitnesses, and instinct. And in Whitechapel, where fear had turned every shadow into a suspect, witnesses were unreliable at best. Detective Inspector Frederick Aberline, a seasoned and respected officer, was placed in charge of the case. He worked tirelessly, chasing leads, interrogating suspects, walking the streets night after night. But each clue unraveled, each theory ended in dead ends. The police interviewed over 2,000 people, investigated 300 suspects, and detained more than 80 individuals. None were ever charged. Some officers believed the killer had medical knowledge, due to the precision of the mutilations. Others argued it was the work of a butcher or slaughterhouse worker, someone used to blood and blades. The crime scenes were chaotic. Crowds gathered quickly. Evidence was trampled. In some cases, bodies were moved before the arrival of trained investigators. And then there were the mistakes. One of the most glaring involved a cryptic clue, the Galston Street graffito. On the night of the double event, Catherine Eddowes' bloody apron was found in a doorway. Above it, scrawled in chalk on the wall, was a message. "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." Was it written by the Ripper, a red herring, or a piece of anti-Semitic graffiti unrelated to the murders? We'll never know. The Metropolitan Police ordered it washed away before daylight, fearing it would spark riots in an already tense immigrant neighborhood. With the trail growing cold, the investigation floundered, and then silence. After the brutal murder of Mary Jane Kelly in November 1888, the killings stopped. Aberline and his team were left chasing phantoms. Eventually, the case was closed. But the questions never were. The Ripper murders may have ended in 1888, but his shadow loomed for decades. In the years that followed, any violent murder of a woman, particularly one involving mutilation, was scrutinized under the same lens. The public and the press were quick to ask, was Jack back? In 1891, Frances Coles was murdered in a Whitechapel alley. Her throat was cut and her body left in a familiar pose. But this time, the mutilations were absent. A suspect was arrested, then released. Was it the Ripper, or just someone who wanted to be? Over the decades, dozens of cases were linked to the Ripper by tabloids and theorists. Most were speculative. Some were outright fabrications. But they all spoke to the enduring grip this killer had on the public imagination. The mythology only grew darker. Writers, filmmakers, and conspiracy theorists kept the legend alive. Jack became a symbol, a representation of evil, chaos, and mystery. He was transformed into a literary monster, a character in fiction, a boogeyman whispered in darkened rooms. But while the name Jack the Ripper became famous, the real story, the women, the city, the fear, was often twisted beyond recognition. And in that distortion, the line between truth and myth blurred forever. In the 20th and 21st centuries, a new breed of investigators emerged, Ripperologists. Historians, criminologists, and amateur sleuths dedicated entire lives to solving the case. They combed through ancient files, decoded letters, tested DNA, traced family trees, and reconstructed timelines with forensic precision. Books were written, documentaries aired. New suspects were proposed, some compelling, some far-fetched. One theory claimed that Walter Sickert, an artist fascinated by death, was the Ripper. Another pointed to Francis Tumblety, an American quack doctor with a hatred for women. In 2014, a controversial book declared that Aaron Kosminski had been definitively identified through DNA. But peer-reviewed scientists pushed back, citing contamination and flawed methodology. Even modern profiling by FBI experts yielded no definitive answer, only possibilities. They described the Ripper as an organized killer, likely living locally, possibly single or estranged, with a background in anatomy or slaughter. But no theory, no matter how compelling, has ever been proven beyond doubt. The Ripper remains just out of reach, a case unsolved, a name unknown. And perhaps that's part of the horror. Why, after all this time, does Jack the Ripper still grip us? Maybe it's the mystery, the facelessness of the killer, the chilling feeling that he walked away unpunished and disappeared into history. Or maybe it's what he represents, a fear that transcends time. Jack the Ripper wasn't just a killer. He was a mirror held up to a society in denial. He exposed the cracks in the Victorian dream, the poverty, the inequality, the misogyny, the institutional failure. His victims were women society had discarded, and in the end, it wasn't just the Ripper who failed them. It was everyone. That's the true horror of this case, that someone could kill over and over again in one of the world's largest cities and never be caught. That someone could slip through the cracks of a world that wasn't watching closely enough. And that even now, more than 130 years later, his name still echoes, while theirs are barely remembered. 5 murders, 5 women. Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, Mary Jane Kelly. Their lives were messy, tragic, human, and their deaths were turned into legend. But Jack the Ripper was not a legend. He was real, flesh and blood, a man who walked among us. And he got away with it. Perhaps he died soon after. Perhaps he moved elsewhere. Perhaps he lived a long life, blending into the crowd, carrying his secret like a stain no one else could see. But what he left behind was more than just unsolved crimes. He left a legacy of fear, of questions, of silence. And in that silence, we are still listening, hoping to hear something that was lost long ago. A confession, a clue, a name. Because until that name is known, Jack the Ripper will remain what he always was. A shadow in the fog, watching, waiting, and just out of reach.